This is Craig Humphreys, lecturer in anatomy at the University of Liverpool, and you are listening to the Academy's Developing Practice podcast.
Hello, in this episode, we chat with Craig about the challenges facing anatomy education and the attempts being made to increase inclusivity. We hope you enjoy. Craig, we're really pleased to be speaking to you today. We're delighted to be hearing about how you and your colleagues in anatomy are trying to make your curriculum more inclusive. But before we get started, we really like to get to know our podcast guests. So could you tell us a little bit about your background, please?
Yeah, not a problem at all. So as you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not from Liverpool. I grew up in a little town outside of Glasgow, and I went to the University of Glasgow to study anatomy. It wasn't my first choice. Like many people who are at like 18, 19, they want to go do medicine and don't get in because it's so competitive. But I was quite interested in sort of pursuing something that was related, and there's quite a strong history of anatomy within the University of Glasgow. And actually in my hometown, there's two famous anatomists who are well known in the UK are actually from there as well. There was a school named after them and all this sort of stuff as well. So I went to university to study this. It's a slightly longer degree in Scotland, so you get 4 years rather than 3, which meant that you get a much better sort of like introductory sort of start-off section, which is not purely about your degree, to sort of cover for the fact that A-levels are a bit longer and more intensive in England compared to Scotland. But when I was doing my degree, I really discovered that actually I really enjoyed anatomy as a concept, and also just found it really interesting because it's not just about, you know, you, me, everybody else, but it's also about history and how we take away lots of parts of our anatomy from history for good or for bad. After I finished my degree, I actually basically didn't know what to do with myself. I sort of decided medicine wasn't really for me necessarily, didn't want to go through that again. So I ended up going to do a master's degree in medical visualization and human anatomy, which is technically speaking a master's degree by the Glasgow School of Art, which is amazing because if you ask any of my students, I do try, but I really can't draw. I'm so bad at drawing. So the fact that I have a degree in that always tends to shock a few people, but it's sort of co-run with University of Glasgow because they have all the anatomy parts and the School of Art have all the visualization components. It was really fascinating. It was interesting to just see how parts of the body can be visualized in different ways, different imaging techniques, and how we can use that to not just sort of teach students, but also reach out to the wider public as well, because people that on that degree have gone on to do loads of amazing things with sort of augmented realities and surgical implants and things like that. And everyone was from different backgrounds as well, which was really interesting. After that, I went to work at University of Glasgow first as a demonstrator in anatomy, so teaching on like medical student classes and also in anatomy sessions. And then by just pure chance, I got offered the opportunity to be sort of slightly more involved and run my own stuff. So I was the lead organizer for first year medicine for a little bit for their anatomy content. And I also ran an international pre-med class essentially for mostly American students, but some from other parts of the world as well, basically to try and help them get into university in America as a medical student in various different forms. But basically they were over as part of a sort of an exchange. So this was a good way to get a bit more of the sort of the heritage of Scotland and Glasgow, and also how anatomy is a massive thing in the UK because there was loads of preeminent scholars here. And actually in that moment doing that job, it made me realise the way that we discuss anatomy is quite variable. So like how you learn about anatomy does absolutely depend on where you live and how you and the resources you have available to you, because we had students coming from the Middle East who'd only ever seen one dissection before, and the person that was being dissected did not represent them at all because of various different rules and regulations regarding body donation in each country. They might be dissecting somebody from America, not somebody from their actual country, which therefore their patients will not match. And that was raised as a problem by them. And it is a problem across that sort of idea as well. And once I finished up there, because university contracts basically expire in that sort of job, I came to Liverpool to be an anatomy demonstrator, same sort of gig basically. My responsibilities for up until last year was basically the second year medicine anatomy demonstrator. So trying to combine gross anatomy with more sort of clinical applications as well. And this is really they always say that it's the hardest year, and I tend to agree with them, because the first year is very pure sciences and a little bit of sort of dabbling in medicine. When you're then trying to put together, well, I understand this part of the brain, but then what happens when that person has Parkinson's? That's really hard, because you're then trying to learn not only the normal pathways, but all the disease pathways as well. So a very rewarding but very stressful job. And then I became a lecturer here as with my current job title, and moved away from that. But now I'm responsible for introductory anatomy modules and for first year anatomy students, and also the lead individual for health sciences as well. So this includes like nursing, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, orthoptics, and various different sort of radiography specialties as well. So it's very much in the forefront of my mind that actually being able to provide sort of inclusive anatomy teaching is really important, because the medical students get a lot more anatomy teaching generally in the UK than most other degrees do. So it's really important that the small amount of time that lots of health sciences degrees actually get within our department is as good as it possibly can be, and does represent the communities that they actually will be engaging with. I do have more of a dog in this fight as well, because my fiancée is a speech therapist. So I know from her experience at university what she got and like the gaps that she felt that she had. And also from engaging with people that we know in my personal life who are like nurses, for example, it is something that needs to be a bit more sort of well discussed, I guess, and the provision they receive has to be better. But basically, I sort of fell into this all backwards. I wasn't the plan. I always sort of thought, I'd like to be a lecturer at one point, and not when I'm in my early 30s. So it's been a bit of a roller coaster ride, but it's been fun so far. But a lot of it's very much sort of trying to get people past their preconceptions of anatomy and making them comfortable in the space and using the correct terminology, which is something I quite enjoy, which is one of the reasons why I was quite happy to speak to you guys today as well.
So in terms of, I think you started to touch on it there. So we're not just talking about medical students that you support with your work. It's a whole range of different clinical based occupations. Is that right? So speech therapy. Absolutely. Yeah. So which students are you specifically working with and supporting?
So specifically, I am responsible at the moment for the sort of first year anatomy students on our anatomy degree program. So Liverpool has a very well respected and well attended, maybe not the right word, but it's got a high number of applicants every single year. And basically it's a pure anatomy degree. So they do, rather than just, so there's no application to it in terms of like, it's not for physiotherapy, it's not for medicine, it's a pure degree. Similar to what I did as an undergrad, but I also am the HARC lead for health sciences, which means that all the health sciences programs that the university teach, so I think there's 6 at the moment, there's probably more than that, and someone from health sciences would be mad if I forget one of them, but there's quite a few that come in at different levels. So like you'll have some in first year, some in second year, some in third year, some that do everything in first year. So each of those has to be tailored to their own sort of like, you know, what the specialties are. You know, for example, the anatomy that a radiotherapist needs to know is very different from something that, say, a physiotherapist would need to know. You, of course, get the overlap, but the relationships between the structures are fundamentally quite different, because radiotherapy is all about spatial positioning. As anyone who knows someone who's had cancer will tell you, it's all about them trying to minimize the effect of the radiation to treat the problem. And that's a massive thing that, to be honest, until I got this lectureship, I didn't know as much about it as I do now. But engaging with the staff in those degrees, it really highlights how important these sorts of things are within sort of like their education. And the students absolutely love the fact that you get these sort of bespoke sessions that are more focused for them, because they obviously hear a lot of the names, but they've never seen a real heart before, or never seen lungs before in person, or a brain, or, you know, how close the structures are to each other, because inside of people's bodies is just a bit of a mystery, really. So we are responsible for the department at large is responsible for over 1,000 students every single year. And obviously within each of those, there's lots of different team members that are responsible for teaching all of this. But I feel that we all sort of sing from the same hymn sheet on this, and basically trying to make it as inclusive and also keep adapting the materials as well, because there's lots of issues within academia, as I'm sure you're both aware, of sort of stagnant materials and things not changing for years, just not for any reason, but just because it's not really a good answer. But we've always had as much as it's frustrating to go through the reviews all the time, it's always been more developed. So it means that the health sciences programs I started teaching last year, by the time I eventually, if I ever move on from this job, it will look very different from what I started with. And that's, great for your own personal development, but also for the students as well.
Craig, so before we get into the module and the sort of challenges that you face at the moment, what brought you to Liverpool? Was it the relationship that with your fiancée that brought you down here? Because I find, having spent some time in Glasgow, they're very similar cities in terms of their outlook. I find the people are quite similar. So what brought you down?
Oh, so basically what happened, when my contract finished in Glasgow, I was sort of applying for anatomy jobs, and anatomy is a very, very small world. And the fact that I think that if you interviewed one of my colleagues, the chance of you getting a Scottish person, really, really strong. Like, there's so many of us floating around. But basically, Liverpool had a very unique program at the time. There's actually now ones quite like it floating around, where you could do this demonstratorship, where basically you teach on all these different classes: medicine, undergraduate anatomy, dentistry, nursing, everything else.
Right.
And you also do your PhD at the same time. And the PhD is sort of in-house. So at the moment, I've got like a year of my writing left, my PhD to finish. But actually, I moved first, and my fiancée is from, this is a very sickening story, but my fiancée and I grew up in the same town. We went to school together, we went to high school together, and then we started dating when I was 18, and that was 13 years ago. And we're getting married really soon. But I moved and sort of moved without really, I was just thinking about it has to be for the job, because there wasn't anything there. And because she's a wonderful human being and is really understanding and knows how important it is to me, she decided she was happy for me to go. But she actually wanted to go back to university anyway to become a speech therapist. So she moved down a year later and went to Manchester Uni. So we've lived here for 7 years. But you're totally right. It's the same place. You get the same vibe, the same feeling. And when I was growing up, I didn't know a lot about Liverpool outside of the Beatles, the football. That was really it, and all these sort of horror stories about it from people I went to university with, and from people when I went to school. But then actually, when I moved here, I was completely blown away by how different it is and how supportive and helpful and caring everybody is that lives here. And it just feels like Glasgow. And my dad's from a very rough part of Glasgow, and he came down to Liverpool the first time, and he was like, "It just feels like home, doesn't it?" And I was like, "Yeah, it does." And everyone says the same thing. And you tend to come across a lot of really well-settled Scottish people in Merseyside because of that, I think, because it feels a lot more like Scotland and Glasgow specifically than other parts of the UK do. It's probably a Northwest thing, to be very honest with you. People just quite like it here. It's just slightly warmer, which is nicer, because it's really, really cold all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's a Northwest thing, but it's definitely a Merseyside thing.
Yeah.
Very different thinkers on Merseyside, without a shadow of a doubt. But yeah, you're right. It is warmer. There's definitely that. That's definitely a bonus.
Yeah.
It's warmer than it is here, and I'm 45 miles south. There's something about Liverpool. It never rains, as I keep being told by many Scousers.
Yeah, I think that's very true, especially given how it's been very warm recently. But actually, I think a lot of people, as soon as the sun comes, it doesn't matter if it's 5 degrees or not. They're outside. They're sitting out in the garden somewhere. So I think it's just it was very easy to feel at home when I moved here. And because obviously working at university, you do get that exposure to so many people from different places who've also moved. Yeah. And I think that makes it easier to sort of to try and engage with people as well, because a lot of them, it's hard. There's hardly a full room full of Scousers in university. There is quite a lot of people from Liverpool who come to do degrees that we teach on, but it's a nice combination. When I was a student at Glasgow, it didn't feel quite the same way. There wasn't actually that many folk from where I'm from, around those sorts of areas. It was a lot more sort of, because of its reputation, it attracts a lot of applications from down south.
Right.
And especially on things like medicine, most of the students were very much that would be their first time in Scotland, being a student there. So it was funny teaching them, the undergraduates and the international students, and they all had lots of the same questions, even though some of them from California, some were from London, and it just was the same question because they both had never been before and had no idea what it was like. So it's very interesting though to sort of move somewhere that's basically the same place that you've previously lived before.
Yeah, it is. I mean, just getting onto the topic of anatomy. So you've made some changes quite recently. So what prompted those changes that you made to the curriculum?
So at the moment, a lot of the changes that we've made are actually much smaller than we would want them to be. It's things like, you know, there is a bit of anatomy, as I was saying before, historically has a bit of an issue in terms of its history, and you can go down various different avenues in this. It's a bit of a magical mystery tour of, you know, the problems that you can encounter. Like any old science, anatomy is steeped in the traditions of the time in which the things were discovered. So there's lots of sort of patriarchal overtones and imperialist overtones, and you need to be very careful about sort of naming conventions and things like that, because a lot of them, although are common terminology used in the world, they really shouldn't be the same sort of way. And also the way that we discuss anatomy is not, a lot of textbooks especially doesn't actually represent what we expect from the modern world. So a lot of the things that we've been doing are quite subtle, but they do make a big difference. So even just things like, as time's gone on and we've redeveloped our curriculum, there's an equal focus on sort of all parts of anatomy, regardless of if it's male or female. So how you talk about the external genitalia is equally described in both. This is a problem that textbooks are only now coming around to correct, and you would see loads and loads of text on one and then barely a mention on the other. And that is a massive problem, because what you were finding was the people knew loads of stuff about one and nothing about the other. And that was a bit of an issue, and that ties into how people are taught sort of outside of the anatomy labs as well. But we've basically tried to balance it all out. So all of the modules have their own sort of, you know, each there'll be like a station dedicated to one, a station dedicated to the other. And then you can basically describe and explain to the students like what's actually going on in each. And there's no preference for one or preference over the other. The other sort of things that we've done include things like we're starting to invest in sort of models to demonstrate different skin tones as well. And this is also something it's a bit more complicated than just sort of buying in the model. So Liverpool and a lot of anatomy departments, we have a tissue license. So we actually have body donors who are basically giving you the most priceless gift they can actually give you is their body for the education and the advancement of research for others, and also to help people practice. There's, we have the surgeons come in, they will do surgical techniques on the cadavers and then use that to go and save somebody's life 2-3 weeks down the line, or something experimental that they're trying to work out if it's going to be a new way forward, things for brain tumors and stuff like that. So it is an amazing gift to give. Unfortunately, you're bound by your catchment area. So depending on what the makeup of the catchment area is, you're going to get a lot more of certain types of people than you are of others. So for example, the majority of the cadavers that we will get in Liverpool are white, because the predominant individuals in this area or our catchment area are white. This does not then reflect itself the same way across other universities. Of course, if they've got an area which is predominantly non-white, then they'll have obviously other people with different skin colours. And that's something that's quite difficult, because as I said, the students are so diverse that they'll all come in and every single cadaver is white. And I have a lot of students who are not white. So therefore it doesn't really match very well. You then get the opposite problem in countries where the predominant skin tone is black and they don't have any white cadavers. So you get people going to universities, medical schools in Africa, for example, and they'll have the opposite problem. And you can't sort of force it to make that bit right. So you have to try and almost compromise on it. So because we get lots of people we'll have people on our lists who want to donate their bodies, who come from all different walks of life and all different backgrounds. But if they actually end up with us or not is very, very delicate and sensitive, depending on cause of death and all sorts of other factors as well, which might preclude them, or their family just aren't happy with it, or there's lots of different reasons why. The same thing happens with males or females as well. So sometimes you just get lots of females or lots of males. You can't really, it's not up to us. It's just a random occurrence.
Yeah. I'm going to ask a really silly question here then. So you can't sort of transport cadavers around different areas once you've got them. You can't, maybe sort of share that, try to get a diverse group within one area.
Yeah. So basically what happens is you have a finite time between the body, the individual passing away, we get informed of it, and then coming into the department. If somebody really wants to, if somebody lives in Merseyside but they grew up in Newcastle, for example, they can say, "Oh, I would like my body to go to Newcastle University." So you might get So in theory, yeah, absolutely, you could get somebody who is black who dies in Liverpool and they want their body to be, because their family lived in Newcastle or they went there, student or something. There's all sorts of different reasons people do this, and then they would go to Newcastle. And that's like, if that's possible. There is the logistical problems, which obviously COVID completely annihilated all of our sort of pathways and how to do these things. But it basically is it's a logistical issue. But you're right, like in theory, you should be able to sort of like spread it all around, because most universities have enough body donors, but they're trying to get the diversification without shuffling people around the country would be really difficult. And also because it's so time sensitive, it wouldn't necessarily work in the same sort of way. But it's a good question. It's a good question, because actually, like in London, for example, they have a central anatomy office. They don't have each university doesn't have its own they'll have someone who's in charge of it, but they won't have the same sort of setup that say Liverpool has, or Manchester, or even like Newcastle or Nottingham or anything like this, because of obviously the universities in London are so close to each other, relatively speaking. Of course, London's massive, but that is a bit of they will more likely see, because it reflects their population is more diverse, they will see more diversification. But trying to move the bodies around, especially when you're trying to make sure that the utmost importance is the cadavers and their families sort of like respect and the care for those individuals. And if we always try to honor what they want to do, but we don't want anything to be traumatic or complicated or difficult for the family or for the person. The other problem is that when you do things like memorial services and engage with the families, it's important to have really strong record keeping, so you know what's happened. If you accept the person, basically it's basically like the department, whichever department it is, becomes legally responsible for your body. And that's really, really important. So like, this is why we instill within the students that it's massively important that they treat all these body donors with respect and the care they deserve, as if they are an actual patient who's still alive. It is a very odd and strange environment. However, it does help build those skills, especially in sort of people wanting to do health degrees. It's not something that it's very hard to have that experience unless you're actually on one of those degrees or you do this sort of job. And trying to explain how you become desensitized to it always raises a few eyebrows, but it is just something you get used to. But giving them that sort of like, this is how serious this is, and this is why it's super important, it does really help, because it means that they get the idea of this is actually something that's incredibly valuable. And then when they're engaging with patients, then they know how important it is. But it is really one of those things that, because it's all legally governed, there's so many things that you have to make sure are right. It's really, really intense and really well constructed and controlled. But actually, one thing we're talking about for like people from Liverpool, people live in Merseyside are amazingly generous. We get so many people emailing in, phoning in, and chatting to our bequeathals team, trying to donate their bodies, or finding out they've got weird things wrong with them, or like some weird developmental thing that they didn't know about until they got an MRI scan, and they'll phone up and be like, oh, you'll never guess what I've got. And like, they won't be able to be an organ donor because of this thing, but they could be a body donor if circumstances allow. So actually, Liverpool is, we're never short of people wanting to do it, but you're then just at the mercy of when do these people unfortunately pass away, which makes it quite a sad sort of waiting game.
Yeah, I can understand that, especially like with that, when you mentioned the families bit. I do know there are sort of little services sometimes held on the university grounds, aren't there? So yeah, I can imagine, holding a service for somebody who might not actually be at that university is not ideal, is it? When that cadaver might have been transported elsewhere, I guess you need to be well upfront with that. And
exactly.
And just talking about that sensitivity thing, I mean, there's a little story here. A few years back, before COVID, actually, I visited the HARC.
Oh, cool.
Centre. Yeah, I got to chat with a couple of technicians in there, and I got a little bit of a tour. And obviously, I've not been around bodies much, so we were having a conversation in one of the areas. There was a couple of sinks in front of me, and there was a couple of bodies behind me, but they had the sort of green sort of covering on them. And I was absolutely fine with the conversation, but the longer I stayed in that room, the hotter and hotter I got, and the more ill I started to feel. And it wasn't because like I could see anything; it was all very dignified. but I just had this really strange feeling. So I can understand that sensitive bit and how you become desensitized after some time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think as well, like a big part of my job is as someone who does like a very introductory module for anatomy students is like one of the first things that they'll do at university if they do an anatomy degree, of course. And they also have, we go through the sort of intro to cadaver and try to make it as inclusive as possible and explain everything, and sort of there's no secrets. We will explain exactly what's going to happen and talk them through it and say like why people donate their bodies, why it's really important, why it's a really massive and important gift for the students to be able to experience. And people react to it in loads of different ways. I mean, me personally, I didn't feel uncomfortable the first time, which raised massive concerns and red flags with my fiancée. She was like, you should definitely feel weird about this. Until years down the line, and she did it and she felt exactly the same way. Maybe it's a Glaswegian thing, but we basically, I didn't feel that weird about it, but there are just certain things that just catch you a little bit. And especially, it's important for the students, especially if they've had sort of like, COVID has been a nightmare the last 2 years. The students come in for that anatomy class. You don't know what's happened in their lives ahead of time. So like some of them might come to you beforehand and say things that, they've had problems with, or people have passed away, or, there's other stuff going on. But sometimes people don't want to say anything and then they get really upset about it because it's, at the end of the day, what you're looking at is something that hardly anybody, if you went with the population percentages, get to see. And it is quite a sensitive and delicate thing. And we always try to explain to the students that it's really important that, you shouldn't feel embarrassed about being upset by it or feeling sensitive towards it. It's actually really, it shows that you care, and it shows that you actually want, you feel that is a person and that you do treat it with the respect it deserves. But some people are just very stony faced about it. And like, I think it's just a lot of it's protective, but we always tell stories about people, I work with people, I know people in anatomy who day one, first class fainted, like, and their job is this now. Like that is the most common thing you hear from people when you talk about this with, everyone knows somebody whose job is now to be the person that dissects bodies, or they're a surgeon, or they're something like this involved with human body, and the day one they fainted. And I mean, I've seen a lot of medical students faint, and I know for a fact that like after the fact they were really good and really engaged with it. It's a very odd thing. The other thing to remember as well is that they're embalmed with chemicals as well. So it's a very pure air atmosphere in HARC actually compared to some other places. But everything's very clean. It's not like a natural sort of environment. So it means that you can feel very sort of uncomfortable. The big thing that people tend to say, which is a bit more lighthearted, is they always get really hungry afterwards. Like that's the one thing that everyone tends to say after you've been in there for a while, especially if it's a dissection class or if they've been in for like a long practical. It must be something to do with the formaldehyde, because I had that feeling as a student as well. And I don't know. And if you ask sort of like anecdotally around anatomists, they'll go, yeah, it always makes people feel really hungry for some reason. Don't know why. It's just one of those things. But I also think people tire themselves out because they do find it so interesting. And it probably makes them feel more hungry, because you sort of people do tend to get a bit lost in it, because they're like, I can't believe that's a uterus. Like, when are you ever going to see that like outside of this space? Even if you're a GP, you can't see it. So you're basically just looking to see and work out, what it looks like, the shapes, the sizes. It's the same with like, people who are really into going to the gym. They want to see what the biceps looks like, because spend so much time thinking about it and working on it and, wanting it to be better and better and better. I've never actually seen one before. And that usually blows people's minds. And they go, I can't believe that's it. And look at the attachments and, that's why it hurts when I do this. And that's why, that sort of stuff. So it is my friends know I've done this job for a very long time. My family do as well. And they still think it's completely bonkers that this is what I talk about and, we engage with. And you're right, like we have those memorial services, and there's one coming up quite soon, in fact. And actually the families ask quite a lot of quite intricate questions and ask about, what we're doing here, and talk about, what do you use the bodies for and how do you explain things. And, we don't know the private details because it's kept anonymized from us, but actually they want to know how useful it's been, and they get a lot of closure from that as well.
No, that's good.
When I think that I think it's something that departments across the board in the UK do really, really well, because it's a very unusual environment, even more unusual than the standard sort of anatomy department environment.
Yeah.
But the families get a lot of closure on that, I think, from the experiences that I've had with it. And I think it actually turns some of them around as well. So some of them come in being very angry about it or stressed about it or not happy that their family member decided to do this, but they respect their wishes. And then they come out of it being, actually, I understand this now, because we have people talk to them who are students and who are doctors and nurses and physios, and who say things like, well, I know how this works now because someone like your dad, mum, granddad, brother, sister donated their body, and now I've seen this and I can apply that later on down the line. So yeah, it's definitely a very sensitive thing, but massively rewarding and helpful to so many people, which makes it such a valuable experience.
It is really helpful, isn't it? I mean, my daughter's doing her A-levels at the moment, and I was at big Tesco's at 11 o'clock last night trying to find a heart, obviously not a human heart, but, you know, and she's texted this morning just to say how much she enjoyed it, because she's been learning about the heart theoretically through the textbook, but actually getting in there today and opening up the heart and looking at the various chambers. And, you know, in terms of her learning, it's so important that students have that opportunity to take what's in the textbook and see it in real life.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the one thing that I think some people, as I said, they get really into it, like, you know, and they, you know, you'll see people come in and they're both a bit confused, and then they start to look at it and go, oh my God, look at this thing. And they ask, and the questions just come tumbling out. And actually, I think that when you go to museums and you see things in jars, that doesn't really give you the actual sense of it, like the tactile sensation of, I mean, when I was the first student at university, we did like a sheep's heart and lungs, if I remember correctly. And although it's obviously not the same as doing like a dissection of a human's heart and lungs, the sensation of it is quite similar. And you also get that same sort of tactile feel for like how important these organs actually are to how your body functions and how you can see how the connections all work. One thing that I really wanted to make sure that I say while I'm here is that when we talk about sort of obviously like inclusion from like how you talk to the student body and how the students are represented, and you know how we discuss the general public at large, there's also the aspect of it that anatomical variation within people actually helps demonstrate this super well. So like I mean, if you go and find 100 sheep and 100 sheep have 100 hearts, and you look at them all, they all will look slightly different, maybe not like fundamentally different, but depending on the health and the age and the sort of general sort of lifestyle of those animals is different. And actually, although we think we're really special, humans suffer this exact same situation. So, you know, like I could line up 6 people who look like me, we all get scanned, and there'll all be differences. And that sort of variation that you see in a non-cookie cutter approach is a massive, massive thing. And seeing something like a heart dissection at A-level or GCSE or at college or anything like that, it does give you an idea that these things, they essentially are the most complicated pump mechanism you've ever seen in your entire life. And actually those sorts of like, you know, if you've had to go and get one from one place and someone's gone to another, they all will look different. And that does start to reinforce that straight away. And in fact, one of the references that I put and for our chat was a paper that was written by Gabrielle Finn, who's professor at the University of Manchester, and she has written a whole paper with her colleagues about sort of decolonizing the curriculum, specifically in relation to skin color and sort of the way we discuss anatomy in that sense. But there's a really excellent graphic in it where it explains like the 10 different bullet points of like how you talk about these things. And one of them that she mentions, which is something that we're aware of but no one talks about, is archetypes within sort of anatomical representation. So if you look in textbooks, every single textbook image looks a little bit like me, because it's usually a white person, they're usually male, they're usually right-handed. That does not cover the whole society of any country anywhere. So, you know, that, and then they're always, you know, they don't look like me because they're always in amazing physical shape. Like they always look like they've just come off a plane, you know, 90 minutes for Liverpool. Like they look amazing. And if you know, there's lots of issues with other things like this in society, but if you think that your body's meant to look a certain way because an anatomy textbook tells you and it doesn't conform to that, that can be massively debilitating for that person, especially if they're already concerned about the way they look or the way they feel. And those sorts of like archetypal representations of like the idealist, and then also the stereotypes and the caricatures that you sometimes see within these things as well. It doesn't help with your understanding of it, because it means that if you don't have the thing that that book says you have, you feel like you're wrong or there's something wrong with you. And that's a massive, massive thing. And having those sorts of experiences where, you know, if you have to source your own sheep's heart to go and then dissect it, the person next to you's one will look probably quite different because it's from a different shop, different place. And that variation, although it's a bit of a stupid analogy, it still works because it means that you've seen variation across a species that people think is generally quite the same. And humans are, despite all of our differences, we have the same organs, everything looks the same, but you get such variation in how it's structured and looks, in the sizes and the shapes and the disease conditions. And if I think personally, if we all were more aware of this from a younger age, that everybody is unique whilst also being the same, it would maybe make people's understanding of other people, cultures, skin colors, lifestyles, everything a bit easier, because you can fundamentally go, well, we're all different anyway. And that's what anatomy is all about, really, is about, it's very universal, but also lets you see the uniqueness in people as well.
Brilliant. So I guess that summarizes exactly what you're trying to do with your curriculum, is to represent that diversity of skin tones, of bodies, female, male, having those different stations that you talked about.
Yeah,
Are there
absolutely.
any other explicit changes that you've made, and what challenges have you faced implementing those changes within the curriculum?
So one of the big ones that when you start to discuss it, it does sound a little bit ridiculous, but there's a massive problem, and it goes back to what I was saying before about the history. There's a lot of structural naming convention in anatomy and medicine, and actually just in science in general, in the use of eponyms, eponymous names for people who discovered these things. Now, fundamentally, like, we're all aware that that's the way things work. You know, people would discover a new part of the body, or a new star in the sky, or a new plant, or a new owl, or a new kangaroo or something, and then they would just name it after themselves. The problem with that is that when people were naming things in anatomy, the only people that were doing anatomy at prolific level were males, and they were predominantly white males, and they were predominantly all people, once again, who unfortunately for me, look like me. And that's generally, you could argue, yeah, people found these things, the credit is deserved. There has been situations in the past where people have had things named after them and have had them taken away from them because of their connotations and links to other things in society as well, which is absolutely reasonable. However, the problem is that when you start to name parts of people's bodies after people, that means that the person has some sort of, not ownership over it, but it's like it sort of dominates the conversation about it. So, and unfortunately, this applies a lot more to sort of female genitalia structures. So almost every part is named after some male anatomist. So the best example of this is so there was in the sort of the 1500s, which is like the founding times of like modern anatomy. There was a few different like sort of scientists and anatomists working in that time. So the first one was Vesalius, who's like the founding father of modern anatomy. His sort of like series of books that he sort of published on, essentially called on the fabric of the human body. There's plates of it at University of Oxford. It's a masterpiece in terms of like the level of dissection and what he was able to show at the time. But he, you know, despite the fact being the most preeminent scholar in anatomy, you go to conferences, people talk about him like, you know, like he is God, you know, like he came up with all this stuff himself. But there's still weird mistakes. There's like weird like drawings of what he thinks like the uterus looks like, and what he thinks that, you know, the female external genitalia versus the male looks like. And that is, you know, that is a problem, because the way that they sort of thought that in that time frame that males and females were just the same, and just that they could just do the males and then just sort of ad lib the rest of it. There's other more ridiculous descriptions where there's basically like there's a male and female sort of like, as it was sort of very binarily described at the time, and the male is completely anatomically correct. The female is not, because there's a big gap in the middle, and where the uterus and the ovaries are meant to be, there's just a little devil that sits there, and it's completely bonkers. But they had the chance to do it, they just didn't think it was worth their time, which is obviously massive patriarchal society issue. However, he himself making those mistakes was not just himself, it was actually across the board. So although he made those mistakes, he had like collaborators who did other dissections as well. And one of the most famous ones is a guy called Gabriel Fallopius. And everyone knows who Fallopius is because of the fallopian tubes. The number of times that myself or one of my colleagues or anyone else in anatomy, if you're talking to students for the first time about the uterus, uterine tubes, and the ovaries, and you talk about the structures and you ask them what they're called, and they say that the fallopian tubes. And if you ask them back, who's fallopia? And they look at you and go, what do you mean? And they don't know it's a person. And that's like one example of the fact that like back then, most of them are polymaths anyway, and they did lots of things. I mean, Fallopia also discovered various different plants and other things as well. So his name's all over the place. But it's not, the naming convention doesn't help you understand that part of your body. If you have a uterus and ovaries and the fallopian tube, where does the fallopian come from? There actually is a Latin name for it, which is much better. The word salpinx means tube, and that actually does describe it much better. But if you're trying to teach people about these things, having extra complex terminology doesn't really help. And also it doesn't represent very well what, like that's that person's body. So why should it be that everybody that has a uterus and uterine tubes has to constantly refer to them as if they were created and owned and designated by somebody else who doesn't actually represent them at all? And I was quite lucky when I was a student that we had lecturers who were slightly ahead of the curve, and they were basically like, don't use eponyms at all in any degree and anything. They were just like, we need to get rid of those because it doesn't help you understand them. It doesn't help anyone explain them. If you tell a student that is there's part of the pelvic cavity called the pouch of Douglas, for example, is a common site for ectopic pregnancies and peritonitis and other things as well. But if the person's just going to be going, who's Douglas? Like, why does it matter? Like, I'd actually much rather know. But if you say, oh, it's the rectal uterine pouch, then in their head they can go, oh, well, it's probably between the rectum and the uterus, then, isn't it? Yeah. And it gives them a bit more of an encouragement. And there are so many of these. Actually, while I remember, in London, there's a place called the Vagina Museum, and they have a Twitter account, and they recently published a list of various different eponyms about various structures that are named after men when actually like classically defined as being female structures, and how like that sort of like, although I don't think that actually people do it intentionally to create those sort of issues, it generates a bit of a hidden curriculum error with those things where people just, you go, oh, so everything was discovered by them, therefore that makes them more important, and therefore the structures themselves aren't important. And I don't really think that's right, but we're quite good within HARC. And I think anatomy in general has got really onto this very quickly in the last few years and tried to basically say, like, you may also hear this referred to as this eponymous name. Try to ignore this. However, it will take such a long time for us to eradicate that from the overall curriculum, because you'll get people who have been working in medicine for 40 years and they're not going to change. Like, there's no, they'll write it in the notes and things like that, but it just means for me anyway, that if a student is trying to explain if someone's having a hysterectomy, for example, or if somebody's having, has ovarian cancer and they're trying to explain it to them, that gives them a bit more ammunition and a bit more support to sort of give them a better explanation of these things. Because actually the real kicker with the fallopian thing is he also discovered a bunch of other stuff as well. There's a fallopian canal, a fallopian ligament, like all sorts of stuff. He actually, it's just that's the one that seems to have just persisted throughout time compared to all the other ones. And that doesn't feel entirely right overall, especially given that it's 2022 modern world. Like, we should be able to just name things what they actually anatomically are, because it helps people understand them better.
Yeah, absolutely. Craig, you've just taught me loads of things there. I mean, I can't wait to listen back to this podcast, because I never knew why the fallopian tubes were called that. I never knew there was a Douglas pouch. When you were talking about male named parts of anatomy, I was thinking, Achilles tendon? I can't think of anything. But no,
yeah.
Is that another one, yeah?
Yeah, so even then, that's a whole other can of worms that we could be here for 3 hours talking about. But basically, yeah, but that's an example of sort of like modern societies picked these things up and then like just carried them through. And there's loads of things that are named after people from the past. So there's like the vein of Galen, who was a very famous Greek anatomist. That's in the brain. People still talk about this all the time. It's got an actual name, and the people just, I think people just, medicine and anatomy in general, because it's nature. If you go back not that very long, it was predominantly, if you look at all the various professors and rectors at the University of Glasgow who were linked to anatomy, they're all it was all the person who taught them, and then their student became the next professor, then it became the next one, and it's just this sort of cyclical effect. And that actually has unfortunately, because they were then teaching all the medical students, all the bad habits and things that they didn't realize were an issue have just been passed on through. And that causes loads of problems, because then people get it in their heads that there isn't any other way to describe these structures. And it's not, they shouldn't have to learn the structural names. But actually, if you have a better understanding of your body overall, then I think that people are generally much happier. And that's why shows like Operation Ouch on CBBC are massive. And I'm a massive supporter of this, because I wish there'd been something like that when I was a kid. Because I was really interested, and I have friends who have small children who watch it and who read books about anatomy now, which were just not a thing when we were little. My friend actually messages me and says, what actually is this? Because he doesn't know, and his 4-year-old does, because he's trying to work out what he should and shouldn't be able to know. But it's that sort of thing. You're right. There's so many naming convention issues. And for me, I just don't want people to sort of feel underrepresented in anatomy, or to get upset about anatomy, or, it is you. You have a right to know these things about yourself.
There's a particularly troubling one. Correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned hysterectomy. Doesn't that come back to hysteria and males naming that part of female anatomy over hysterical behaviours or something like that?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, the actual details of it, I'm not entirely sure, but basically, yeah. So the root wording of it is that it would have been the hysterics would have been the sort of I always get this the wrong way around. There's going to be someone who did Latin at school who's going to come for me for this one, basically. But you could call it a uterectomy. That's fine. Right. That actually is what it's anatomically would be called. But you're right. It was the removal of a uterus was linked to women being hysterical, and that's where it comes from. And actually, in the reference list, it's not about that specifically, but there's also the same problem with with a nerve called the pudendal nerve. And the word pudendum is commonly linked to the word shame. And although everybody has this nerve, you don't talk about it so much in people who don't go through childbirth. And the reason for this is that nerve is used as a sort of common anaesthetic site to stop pain during the birthing process. And it means that it used to be that there's a big textbook, so the Terminologica Anatomica, which is basically all the actual defined terms of anatomy are in this book. And one of the things that happens in that is that they basically tell you what you can and can't say, or you're supposed to try and follow these guidelines. Some people just ignore it, but other people are really quite strict about it. But they have now updated theirs to say that you shouldn't really use the word pudendum to describe the external genitalia, because what was happening was the pudendum was, so there was the pudendum masculine, the pudendum feminine, and the pudendum masculine just disappeared from use, and it was just being used to describe the female. Because that word has connotations, it actually has some positive connotations and a different interpretation, which one of the papers that I've linked explains. But it always comes back to shame, and it means that name of the shame nerve, which means that then you'll have, if somebody looks that up, and it's, if it's, say, somebody who's feeling quite down about themselves, or they're insecure about their body or anything like that, and they see that this nerve that they have that's important about their body and is linked to their external genitals is linked with the concept of shame and something you should be embarrassed or concerned about, that's a terrible, terrible thing to happen.
Yeah.
Actually, it's the same issue as the hysterectomy. It's exactly the same problem. It's that, why are we using outdated terminology for something that actually can be quite negatively impactful on people? Because, if that, not everybody knows these things, but it has a sort of there's all these sort of murky connotations floating around over the back of it. And the pudendal nerve is really important because it provides lots of innervation to your pelvic floor, your perineum, and it makes all the structures function really well. But everybody has one. The actual wording itself is not great, but actually everybody's got it, but it doesn't get talked about unless people are going through labor and that's the problem with it. And then because the word pudendum actually means sort of, you can make it mean external genitalia, when people then start to talk about things like the vulva, which is a topic that plagues anatomists, because in anatomy we basically talk a lot about trying to make sure people know the difference between like the vulva and the vagina. And there's a Guardian article that I've linked. So I do a talk every year for or the last couple of years at least, for the Student Neonatal Obs and Gynae Society on the anatomy of the female reproductive tract. And that's one of the things that they talk about all the time. It's like when they're talking to patients, it's like someone saying, oh, I've got this problem with this part of my body, and they don't know the difference between the vagina and the vulva. They don't understand why those things are different and why that's important, and why one thing that treats one thing won't treat the other. And that's it's a big thing in sort of general social media discourse about people's bodies and about bodily autonomy, but it's a massive problem because I think people just glaze over these things. And actually, these are all well-defined structures. We know a lot about them, but it's just people don't take them very seriously, and then they attach negative connotations to them, which is really bad. I mean, you don't have to go too far back to realize that people were also giving people frontal lobe lobotomies and things like that, and treating them with like electrical prods because they thought they were hysterical. Like, it doesn't have great connotations, and it's something that we need to try and move away from. But actually nowadays, you find that books and explanations and lectures and slides and all these sorts of things are better at this now, because we are aware of the various issues, basically, and we want people going forward to know as well.
Yeah, so just on that, Craig, coming back to your practice, so have you had any feedback from sort of stakeholders, for example, your students or colleagues within HE sector, regarding some of the changes that you're implementing?
So generally speaking, the students do seem to positively react to any sort of changes that we make. So, when we talk to them about representation and talk to them about sort of the diversity within anatomy and what they'll see within their patient base, they are generally much happier to know about these things, especially with things like the sort of the eponyms as well, like trying to get them to understand. You sometimes feel like you're just unlocking a door for them when you say, actually, that's what that is. And they go, oh my God, I didn't know. And now I understand that, I can just learn the actual anatomy, and I'm not trying to learn another 50,000 terms to cover the same thing. And you also have as well that, when you are spending more time in an anatomy lab with people and you're showing them the anatomy, that you're trying to represent it as best you possibly can, the students do get a lot more out of it. And that's one of the reasons why I've been doing that Obs and Gynae lecture, is that, for me personally, I don't think I'm the best person to do it personally. I think that there's other people who'd be better to do it than me, but I think that it needs to be done because it's something that we do need to be talking about, and that you want it to be right, and you want people going into clinical practice to be doing the right things, and that's really, really important. But I think they always seem quite happy about it, and I think that what we found as time's gone on, our department's grown quite a lot, and generally speaking, people are happier to try and do these things, and the sort of, it's almost sort of there's more of a shift in anatomical education from the way it was quite old fashioned for quite a long time. The first conference I ever went to was very much sort of old guard anatomy conference. Everyone was a surgeon, everyone was 65 years old. It wasn't a great representation, despite the fact when I was a student at university, I was one of 3 guys in a class of 45. That's something's gone wrong in the representation, somewhere down the line. But nowadays, it seems to be going the other direction. There's a lot more women in sort of very preeminent, powerful positions within anatomy and anatomy publications, and trying to make that more engaging is appreciated by the people involved in it. I think as well, it's listening to how to use the terminology and how to explain things in the correct way. So nothing is ever done unilaterally by us. If I write something and somebody reads it and don't like it, or they're like, I think you need to change this. So obviously there's trying to use the correct terminology makes a massive difference, but it's being able to take that feedback on and adapt it and make it better and make it more inclusive is massively important. And also, as I said before, highlighting the sort of downfalls that exist through, just the way that it's structurally organized. We're not going to have a lot of people from the Middle East donating their body, because they don't donate their bodies, because that's a problem they have in the Middle East as well. We're not going to get the population dynamics that somewhere else would have, because we just don't have those within Liverpool. But making the students aware of those and fielding their questions despite them being awkward and trying to give them the best possible answers is a massive, massive thing. And it's just not shirking the responsibility, I think, is a big thing. But the students appreciate that, because I think people don't like being fobbed off and lied to, do they? So they can tell if you're just hiding it from them. So, being upfront and honest about it, they appreciate it, and it makes them more ingrained within the sort of, when they do their own practice or do their own degrees, or when they're writing reports or whatever, they will change their practice, and that works going forward as well.
Craig, thank you so much. There's so much in there that I want to go away and reflect on and think about, and I know it will be really useful for colleagues as well. And you've mentioned a couple of reports and articles which we'll link to in the show notes in the reading list as well, so thank you for those. But we always end our podcasts with this same question. The podcast is called the Developing Practice Podcast, and we really like to finish each recording with 3 or 4 take-home tips that listeners can reflect on in terms of their own personal practice. So if you wanted to leave us with a few things to think about, what would they be?
So, as I said before, I'm certainly not the expert on this, or maybe even the right person for all of these things, but I think that there's a few things. The first one for me is just being critical of your own privilege in terms of inclusion is a massive, massive thing to do. Because, as I said before, when I was learning anatomy as a student, every book looked like me. I was lucky that every book represented a version or an idealized version of myself, but it doesn't represent necessarily either of you, doesn't necessarily represent all of our students, because everyone has different parts of their anatomy, everyone has different shapes and sizes, and that's a massive issue, because it means that you get people who will feel alienated, and if they're not feeling good about themselves to begin with, you need to be aware of that. And also it means that you can then sort of, you can come down to another person's level, which could make a massive difference. And so when reading textbooks and papers and that sort of thing, there are now a lot more signposting. So for example, Complete Anatomy, which is the foremost digital anatomy program, which Apple use in all their adverts and stuff, they've got a brand new complete female anatomy model. The previous one was sort of I don't know how they did it, but they basically had sort of almost bolt-on male and female. But now they've got this big rollout of this completely brand new female anatomy model, which is great. It's a bit overdue, but it is great. It's good to see. And a lot of the textbooks now we start to get press releases from them saying we have changed this part to talk about gender, to talk about skin color, to talk about the surface anatomy differences, to talk about how we reference sort of gender reassignment surgery, things like this. Stuff that was a sentence is now becoming a bit bigger. So they are out there. You just need to try and diversify your sources. The other one, obviously, as I said within the piece, was about if you are working in science, anatomy, medicine, healthcare, anything like that, the big thing is that if you see people with things named after them, just quickly check that why it's named after them. The context is so important to the students, because even if you know a little bit about the person, if you know a bit about who Fallopius was, and you can explain, well, this was in the 15th century, we're now X number of years down the line, that makes a massive difference. As I said, that the Twitter thread from the Vagina Museum Twitter account is really, really useful. They post loads of really cool stuff. And they're based in Camden in London, and basically trying to help people get more educated. And they often have very well worded responses to people when they ask questions, which is nice. This one is maybe, it sounds a bit more idealistic, but it's not to try and assume other people's lived in experiences are the same as yours. So I mentioned before that when I was at school, I sort of went to a high school in a town that had 2 famous anatomists from it. These guys have museums named after them, one in Glasgow, one in London, the 2 biggest anatomy museums in the UK, basically. But I didn't really do anatomy at school at all. It was plant biology is all we got, because the guy that ran the department was a plant biologist. And that's kind of just what happens when you're at high school. It just depends on what it's like. So I came to university and didn't really know anything about it. And my love of it was sort of sparked by being in that environment. I was quite fortunate. I didn't have any negative preconceptions that came from my education. Things weren't hidden from me. It just wasn't taught. I could have looked it all up. We had books about it, but you don't know if somebody else has maybe been told either nothing at all, or it's been hidden from them, or even worse, because people with work in bad faith could potentially be telling them things that are wrong, like why that structure is named that thing, or what that means, or you should be ashamed of this thing, you shouldn't be happy about this, and that's a bad part of your body, and this is a good part of your body, all that sort of stuff. And my experience wasn't like that, but doesn't mean that somebody else's wasn't. And when you're involved in a large catchment group of students talking over thousands of people, you're going to find people whose experiences don't match yours, and assuming that everyone knows your experiences is just something to be avoided. And the last one for me is that I think it's always better to try and make positive changes and fail rather than not try at all. It's worth making the effort to try and improve. And even the smallest thing I've found over, making yourself approachable, of course, is something that as academics is something that we always try to do. But even something as simple as, if someone is struggling in their personal life, or they have decided they want to represent themselves in a certain way, they want to see the world reflected back in other people. And so if it's as easy as having your Zoom ID have your pronouns in them to make someone feel more included, so that they can maybe talk to you about other more complicated questions that they have, then I think that that's only right that people do so. So it's just being, and if it doesn't go well, or if something goes wrong, or someone raises an issue, then as long as you're trying with the best of intentions, I think that's all you can really do. I realize it's a minefield of a topic, but I think that's the only real way that you can try and go forward, because nobody's perfect. It's just about trying to do the right thing.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. Thanks so much for your time today.
No problem.
Well, I'm sure you enjoyed that one as much as I did. Craig really knew his stuff, and it was great to have that really insightful conversation with him. One of the things that stood out to me was around the historical naming of female anatomy, primarily undertaken by white males. And it's so important from an inclusivity view, we use appropriate naming for anatomy. This is really helpful for students for so many reasons, particularly helping them to locate where these parts of the body are.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Craig was saying about the whole issue to do with representation in the curriculum and how he's really trying to enhance that. He spoke about using cadavers with different skin colours, different sexes, just to ensure that students see that representation in the work that he's doing. Well, if you'd like to take your thinking further, we've added some further resources to the website on a specific podcast reading list, which you can access at liverpool.ac.uk/the-academy/podcast. Also, please do let us know what you thought about this episode. You can tweet us at LiveUniAcademy, and you can also find us at eLearnerMatt or at Alexandra_Owen on Twitter.
And we're really grateful for those who have already taken the time to either rate or review our show in your podcast provider's app. So if you haven't done so already, please do review the show, as it really will help others find us. Bye for now.